I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. After a bit of absence because I wanted my listeners to be able to catch up on the past few episodes, I'm back with a new episode featuring journalist and activist Hadas Thier, author of A People's Guide to Capitalism, an Introduction to Marxist Economics, to discuss her recent piece in The Nation entitled How DSA Built Zohran Mamdani's Electoral Machine. We'll be discussing the ground game of the Democratic Socialists of America and how their strategies helped secure Mamdani's primary victory. All that and more on this edition of the program. Let's get right to it with Hadas Thier. And as always, before we begin the conversation, I'd like to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible by supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Without you, I couldn't do this show. I do have, however, one sponsor that also helps this show along with you, the listener, and that sponsor is the mighty Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. I've actually had listeners who have benefited from Mike's trading tips and financial news. Check out his work at wallstreetwindow.com, where you can also get a free ebook by Mike entitled The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. Highly recommend it. His newsletter is very worthwhile. Check it out, wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, on to the conversation. Welcome to Parallax Views. A guest that I'm very, very happy to be speaking with. She's made some time to speak with us today. I'm speaking with Hadas Thier, author of The People's Guide to Capitalism, a book that I need to get my hands on. I discovered her, though, recently through an article she wrote for The Nation, How DSA Built Zohran Mamdani's Electoral Machine, and I wanted to have her on to talk about that article. How are you doing? And maybe you could give my listeners a little bit of background on yourself and your involvement with DSA.
Sure. I'm doing okay. I feel like that's something we always need to qualify these days. Doing as well as can be, given that, we live in pretty wild, scary times. But Zohran's campaign and victory, which we'll talk more about, has definitely been a boost in an otherwise dismal, bleak landscape. But yes, and I'm currently in Japan for a few months, so it's late over here, and I apologize for any brain fuzziness I may have after a long day, but I'm happy to be speaking with you. And I'm a member of DSA for a few years. Before that, I have been around the left for a very long time, and I'm not like a super active member But I mostly because I'm also a parent and I have some limitations on what I can do. But I am based in New York City, where the chapter of DSA has done some, I think, phenomenal work around electoral campaigns and culminating in the primary victory we just saw with Mamdani's campaign.
So I feel like this piece in The Nation was actually very interesting because I think it took a little bit of a different angle on Zohran Mamdani. We've heard so much about, oh, he's young, he's charismatic, and he's both of those things, of course. But I think your angle was, well, there's an organization behind this, and it was a very volunteer-based organization, the Democratic Socialists of America. Can you talk about how your angle in this article differs maybe from some of the other news media and op-eds we've seen on the subject of Mamdani's primary win?
Sure. I mean, I think it's understandable that a lot of the discussion has focused on him being young and charismatic in a Democratic Party landscape that has been woefully lacking in those qualities. So, he sticks out because he is young, he is charismatic. More importantly, he has a vision. He puts forward a positive alternative for why to vote for him rather than just don't vote for the other guy, which I think is mostly the Democratic Party's method of operating. But I think the important thing, and this is what, yes, I tried to draw out in this article, is that he comes out of an organization, which is important for a couple of reasons, both because it, his politics, his political home, his experience, he has been an active member of DSA, participating in and canvassing and helping to lead various electoral campaigns himself before he became a state assembly member a few years ago. He didn't just like come and seek out DSA's endorsement, which he did, but he really came out of the ranks of DSA. And his vision for what kind of a campaign to run was based on very clear knowledge of what those campaigns could look like, should look like. Obviously, DSA had to scale up much more for a mayoral campaign than they have in the past, but the basic framework of a structure has been in place, and they've been building that over the course of the last few years. And Zohran has been an important, part of that. So it's important in that regard, but it's also important, and this is, a lot of the focus of the article, in terms of how that campaign itself organized on the ground and why it was able to deliver the kind of win that it did. And this had much more, I think, importance and significance than just him as an individual having charisma, even having good politics, obviously, which I believe he does. Beyond the good social media that he had, which I don't want to minimize that. I think you really do need good social media if you want to run an effective campaign. He had those things, but he had he came out of an organization that could field a strategy and an operation and a structure that could actually knock on over 1 million doors in New York City. And that is a huge deal. And we can talk more about why that is. It's not just the numbers of it, but it's who they reached and how effectively they reached people and how they built that infrastructure to be able to do it, that I think is so critical.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more in depth. But I also wanted to ask you, how has it adapted over the years? Because I think in the article you mentioned that, there's been times where the DSA hasn't always had victories, and it's adapted uh, you know, in ways that have allowed it to learn and, make this accomplishment happen with Mamdani's win. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, a few things. One is that I think one of the exciting things about New York City DSA's electoral strategy, and it's different than much of the left, certainly that I have participated in or seen myself, is that their strategy is to win, not just to run campaigns for the sake of like propaganda machines or like protest votes, but actually trying to strategize about where can we win and how. And that's one thing that I think is really important. That said, they have won and lost various campaigns, like you've said, and it hasn't been a prerequisite that they have to win, because then you just don't run campaigns. They have gone into campaigns kind of with as clear of a strategy as possible to try to win, but also knowing that when you lose, you still learn. And you don't just learn, lessons of what worked and what didn't work. You learn really important, data. They every time they run a campaign, they keep information about all of the neighborhoods that they canvassed. They build up information about who the voters are there, who the constituents are, who the people that they've talked to at the doors. They have, files on all of these neighborhoods where they've canvassed, and they are able to continue to build on that. And they also learned, I think one of the really crucial things is about how early you have to start. You have to start way earlier than a conventional campaign because nobody knows your name when you're the underdog and you're not the establishment, candidate. You have to have volunteer infrastructure much deeper and wider than maybe they initially started with. They've built an operation where they have, and I kind of outlined some of the details of this in the article, but different layers of volunteers, right? Where you have like the canvassers, but then you have the canvas leads who organize the canvassers, and then you have the field leads who organize the entire like sections that can deploy canvas leads. And then, you have, more of the campaign staff. So you have these different layers that facilitate being able to bring more people into the fold. And that's one of the things that I think is so significant about their strategy, is that they're purposefully trying to bring more people into the fold, whereas more conventional campaigns tend to gatekeep skills, where it's like there's the people that work for the campaign, and then you have the like canvassers, and there's that division, instead of actually trying to make, if there's a canvasser who's enthusiastic and keeps coming back, then they can become a field lead and they can organize their fellow canvassers and neighbors and so on. You can go from being a canvas lead to a field lead, et cetera, and actually build a depth of organizing power in that way.
If you could, in that regard, one of the things you mentioned is that the DSA really went for a field first campaign. What does that mean for listeners that are unfamiliar with the terminology?
Right. So in any campaign, there's different departments of the campaign, so to speak. There's the field operation, which we just talked about and described, the canvassers and going out and talking to people. There's the communications folks in a campaign. There's the fundraising folks. There's, I don't know what, operations. I'm missing various things, but usually in most campaigns, the communications and the fundraising are kind of the most important, right? You need to raise money, and this is we see in any campaign that if you follow campaigns at all or just are an audience to those campaigns, you get constant texts and emails and so on to like donate, which is important. I don't want to minimize that because especially when you're running a grassroots campaign, you need money to field all of the work that you do. But there's the fundraising folks, and then there's the communications folks who like do all the like advertising and the making sure the story gets out into the newspapers and and those are kind of like the engines of most campaigns. And what DSA in New York has done is to flip that on its head, where what happens in the field is most important. What happens in going out and talking to regular people, both established voters, but also significantly people who haven't voted before. How do you reach those people, especially given you're usually the candidate that doesn't have name recognition? And, I talked to one of the folks who's quoted in the article who made a really good point, who's worked on various campaigns through DSA, which is that when nobody knows your name, the best way to make the name and the politics and the platform associated with that name stick in people's minds is to have one-on-one conversations. That sinks in much more so than just seeing an ad or what have you. And so for the chapter of DSA in New York running these campaigns over the last few years, they've really put that first, and everything else kind of functions to support the field campaign. So you do fundraising in order to build the capacity of your field campaign. You do communications so that when you go out and talk to people, there is a clear campaign communications that are being being communicated to people. So everything that you do kind of helps to feed that field campaign, because the field campaign is what wins the campaign.
It's interesting. One of the great quotes from the article is one of the folks you interview says, if you gave the Cuomo campaign a list of 50,000 people who said they wanted to volunteer for them, they wouldn't know what to do with it. But the DSA did know what to do. Can you speak about that? I mean, how do you get this massive number of people coming out to knock on doors? Because that, as you point out, that's not just a result of a well-honed logistical campaign. It comes from the politics itself.
Absolutely. And I think if there's anything that I would want someone to get out of this article and what I'm arguing in general, it's that point that you can't separate out basically form from content. You can't just replicate DSA's method here and have crappy politics. There were various things that were going around social media during the primary campaign where Cuomo canvassers, were Zohran Mamdani fans, and the one guy that I talk about in the article who is interviewed on TikTok or something. I can't remember which platform, but he's like, I'm really embarrassed to be wearing this shirt. I think Cuomo is reprehensible. It's like you have the way that you get 50,000 people to go out and knock on doors is you have to have a politics and a vision that excites people. I went out myself and I canvassed, any number of times. The last time I went out was just, in the complete heat wave. It was, just dripping sweat. Everybody, all the canvas leads were handing out like tons of water bottles, making sure everyone was drinking regularly. To go out and campaign like that, to knock on strangers' doors as you're, sweating bullets for 3 hours, 6 hours, however many hours you can do in a day. You have to really want it. You have to really want your candidate to win. And that's what DSA has. And not just in terms of their own members, but in terms of a politics that speaks to people well beyond their members. You know, Mamdani's campaign was focused on affordability. And, you know, if you talk to anyone in New York City, you know that that's the challenge of living, you know, that's the day-to-day struggle of living in New York City. And beyond that, you know, that he didn't shy away from the social justice issues, which the Democratic Party, again, has been loath to talk about anything related to Gaza, God forbid, or, you know, any number of what they would consider thorny issues, you know. But Zoran talked about those issues, didn't shy away from them. And as a result, both the people who were galvanized by his campaign, many of whom had never voted before, many of whom had voted for him, but also who were willing to go out and therefore volunteer for him and for that vision, is you can't separate that from the infrastructure of the campaign itself. That's what made it possible. And that's also incidentally, you know, why the kind of campaign that DSA ran and runs also flows from a politics of wanting to empower regular people and working people, and not gatekeep skills, actually try to
I
plug
think you used
people
the term
in.
that's like it's the DSA special sauce.
Exactly. And I can't take credit for that. That was Grace Massar said that, who's the one of the leaders of the chapter in New York City.
You had an interesting portion of the article, and I wanted you to explain it because I was confused just a little bit about it. It's a whole section called DSA is seed money, and seed money gets used in quotes. So maybe you could explain that portion of the article a bit.
Sure. So I think, you know, one of the main points that I wanted to make here is that the volunteers that powered Zoran's campaign were not just DSA members. And there was no way that even DSA has grown very significantly over the last few years in New York City, and they have, you know, tens of thousands of members, and that's hugely important. But you know, you can't knock on over 1 million doors. You can't reach 6-digit figure number of voters, with, you know, tens of thousands, even members, even though that's, you know, that's a good number to start with, but that isn't what you need much more than that. That could be a fine starting point for some of the other campaigns that DSA has run before, for, you know, city council, for state assembly, for state senate, because you have smaller locations and neighborhoods where, you know, DSA has a concentration of members, and those members can hit the ground running and hit the streets. And, you know, the number of people that actually vote in those elections is much smaller, and you can reach those people with the amount of DSA, with the amount of members that DSA has, generally speaking. But to reach, you know, hundreds of millions of people ultimately, in New York City, you need much greater numbers. And so the point that I was trying to make about DSA being the seed money, again, I think this is probably Grace's phrase, terminology, and not
Yeah, I
mine.
think it was Grace's. I'm looking at it right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that this is the DSA, you know, provided the initial, you know, in the way that in the way that when you fundraise for something, you need an initial kind of investment by like hardcore investors, first investors, or whatever they're called. I don't know. In this sense, right, in a campaign sense, you needed that initial influx of kind of hardcore campaign volunteers that could be the first canvas leads, be the first field leads, get that going. And that way, when there is an influx of more folks who find out about the campaign, they have somewhere where they can plug into, because there's already been that initial stage of the campaign built, and it's largely been built by DSA members. It's then becomes open to much wider groups of people, but DSA fronts that initial amount of volunteers, basically.
Right, right. So the volunteers are that's the comparison to seed money. I
Yeah,
get it. Yeah. Um, and it's fascinating because you point out the New York City DSA in December 2024 held that town hall meeting with Mamdani. Uh, More than 300 people attend. And then that group, you know, ends up helping to bring in 400 more volunteers.
exactly.
So, yeah. Can you want to comment a little bit more on that and how it's almost like you get a ball rolling and it keeps growing and growing?
Exactly. Exactly. And um you need that initial layer to get that ball rolling, and they have to be a sort of like that foundation has to be a pretty strong foundation to begin with. And this was made up of not all 300 people, but many of whom had campaigned for a whole host of other in a whole host of other campaigns and elections. They already had experience. They didn't have to be trained. Some of them did, some of them didn't, but you had enough people there to have like that initial quorum and initial momentum going, people that didn't have to be trained out of the gate and could turn around and train other folks. And that's really important. That's why you build an organization, over the course of time. That's why whatever it is, the 7 or 8 years of campaigning in New York City in various elections, some of which won, some of which lost. You build that capacity. You build the actual experiences of people on the ground that know how to do this, and they know how to train other people to do this. And that's hugely important.
How important was it for the campaign and the New York City DSA to really bring in people that weren't even necessarily associated with DSA? Because you point that out a few times in the articles, and it gets into the issue of opening up sort of alliances, left liberal alliances, and whatnot. Can you speak more to that? Because I think it is important the way in which these volunteers ended up bringing in so many people that were even outside the DSA.
Yeah, absolutely. And, by the end of the primary section of the campaign, DSA members were a minority of folks that were actually the field leads, and certainly the canvassers. And that's important for a number of reasons. One is, just the basics of doing the math. You just can't reach the number of people you need to reach with just DSA members. Two, it's important in terms of just the wide resonance of the politics. That if you have a campaign that just resonates with your organization, that's only going to get you so far. But the point is that DSA's politics were proven in practice as resonating widely, not just with voters, but with people who were activated and were inspired enough to get involved themselves. That matters a lot in terms of making the campaign happen, making the campaign viable, making the campaign able to win. So that's the other aspect of it. And then I think, it also points to more broadly what kind of political coalitions and relationships power this campaign at all different levels, not just at the volunteer basis, but there were a whole number of organizations that actually endorsed Mamdani's campaign, that participated to varying levels in terms of turning out the vote. There were community groups that played important roles. There were also, more liberal organizations. There were not a lot of unions in during the primary part of the campaign. Now there are more. And then, of course, there's like figures, obviously, famously, Mamdani and Brad Lander co-endorsed each other, which was, I think, an amazing and inspiring approach and tactic. But it really points to, I think, not just a way to win a campaign, but maybe even more importantly, it provides a model for how do we fight a rising right in this country? How do we bring together left organizations with liberal organizations, with labor organizations, and the rank and file of those organizations, but also the leaderships of those organizations. I think that this campaign provided a very important model that's sorely needed, and I hope can be replicated.
Just a few more things here. How would you like to see Mamdani's, where would you like to see that momentum go? Not just from Mamdani, but for the DSA. There's a lot of momentum thanks to this primary victory. Where do you want to see that go? And, one of the criticisms I always hear from, a lot of like the more centrist media is, well, New York is just New York. And, this isn't going to grow outside of that. And I think that's not necessarily true. I do think populist economic messaging has an appeal right now.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if I had one wish, it would be for like these kind of for the politics that powered Mamdani's campaign to be the politics that animate campaigns all over the country. And Bernie Sanders has played a huge role in developing those kind of politics, and developing a new generation of people that have been inspired by and are leading the charge now around those politics. I recently was watching a video of him. I can't remember if he went to West Virginia, but he went into like the heart of like, a Trump a county that had gone, for Trump in 2024, and just spoke to Trump supporters and spoke to various people, and like people were really into what he said. People were like, "Oh yeah, absolutely, I agree with you," and you're not so bad. Like it turns out, you seem like a decent guy, and you say the things that make sense to me. These politics, I think, are widely resonant, absolutely outside the bounds of New York City. And I think my hope around where this momentum goes, I think I have a lot of hopes. One is in New York City itself, like for Mamdani to actually be able to carry out the agenda that he has laid out. First, he has to win the general election, of course. It looks very likely that he will. But then he has to actually be able to govern. And that's going to be very challenging. And that's a topic of a whole other conversation.
Do you mean just with all the forces sort of lining up against him?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so how does that happen? And so a lot of the momentum of the campaign has to translate into momentum of on the ground organizing to back these policies, to push for these policies. They can't come just out of City Hall. It's going to have to be organizing power on the ground that works in the sort of inside outside strategy in New York. And I think that if he's able to make some headway, that will both that will build more momentum, and that will make the case that these politics can actually be effective, not just win campaigns, but be effective and make real changes, real impacts on people's lives. That will mean that more people in New York City and outside New York City will not shy away from these politics, that organizations like DSA and other organizations will support those campaigns, will launch more campaigns. I think that both in terms of the impact on people's lives and in terms of the inspiration and impetus for more campaigns like this to run and to win, that would be certainly my wish. I think that, the New York City chapter of DSA has, in my mind, and again, I'm based in New York, and I can't pretend to be an expert about what happens around the country, but as far as I can tell, is really at the forefront of this kind of strategy. And so I think it also means that, like, DSA itself as an organization around the country will hopefully draw these lessons and help to run more campaigns like this, as well as, like I said, organizations outside of DSA as well.
Just before closing out, I'm sure you've seen some of the media coverage of Mamdani's primary win. What do you think the biggest myths that are being perpetrated are? Because I think there's a lot of attempts to like throw water on the momentum by the forces allied against Mamdani and against the DSA. So what do you think the biggest myths are that need to be busted about this primary win?
Well, I mean, at the top of the list is obviously there's just a lot of, not just right wing, but Democratic Party establishment, slanders and myths about Mamdani himself that are really outrageous. And obviously, voters themselves didn't buy it. That he's a radical communist and an anti-Semite and whatever. There's a whole list of things you can find in the New York Post and other outlets. So there's all of that, obviously. But then I think, and this gets to kind of where we started the conversation, that this was, in part a fluke, in part, he's young and he has a nice smile. He made stuff up, in terms of like what he plans on delivering, that he won't ever do that. All of those kind of things that really just seek to undermine his politics, DSA's politics, um, politics of democratic socialism and working class politics in general.
Well,
Um,
even the way that Cuomo's loss was framed, because going into it, it was, well, obviously he's going to be victorious over Mamdani because, he's part of a political dynasty. And then afterwards it became, well, he was just too toxic because of all the scandals and whatnot. I think it was more than just that, though. I don't think it was just that. I mean, I think Cuomo was toxic to a lot of New
yeah,
Yorkers, but I think there was also just the fact that the Mamdani campaign and the DSA were very like boots on the ground, part of their community. It's sort of
yeah,
like,
yeah,
well, who are you going to trust? The people in your community or you're a talking head on TV?
yeah, absolutely. And I just to say one quick thing too about that is that I think that there was a lot, also a lot of kind of trying to undermine who it was that came out to vote for Mamdani and who it was that came out to volunteer for Mamdani, as like DSA or just like kind of um, young white, you know, um, lefties that are out of touch with like real regular New Yorkers and so on. That clearly did not pan out in terms of the amount of votes that Mamdani received and from where. Obviously, there's some places. There's still some places left to go, really significantly. Around Black working class corridors that have been very loyal to the Democratic Party and kind of saw the stalwart and the Democratic Party establishment person as like their person. There's still ways to go in terms of some of that, but I think that overall that has been really a mischaracterization. Um, and yeah, like you said, it had a lot more to do with who people were voting for than who they were voting against. Um, I think it's not incidental that Cuomo is and was toxic, and same for Eric Adams, even though he didn't end up running in the primary. But that's also a reflection of the state of the Democratic Party establishment. That's like the best that the Democratic Party establishment could put forward. Um, that also says a lot, and it speaks to why people are rejecting that and going for an alternative. But you have to actually provide an alternative, and that's really the important thing. That's the number one takeaway. Like, what is the alternative that you're putting forward? You need an alternative to the Republicans, and you need an alternative to the Democratic Party establishment stalwarts.
And is there anything that I missed that you would like to point out in closing? I hope I did a good job of covering the basics of the piece you wrote. I mean, it gets even a little bit more in depth than that, so I suggest people read it in the latest issue of The Nation. But is there anything else you wanted to add, I guess, at the end here?
I mean, the only thing that I'll add is just to emphasize something that we touched on about, what comes next. Should Mamdani hopefully win the general election, winning the election is only the beginning of the battle. And so I think that the important thing, certainly for us, for me, like as a New Yorker, but also more broadly, right, is how do we turn uh, electoral victory into an effective, you know, uh, politics on the ground where we can prove that economic populism is not just like a good campaign tool, but can actually make people's lives better and can actually be an effective tool against a rising right. And all the attempts that we'll see, um, not just locally, but obviously nationally in terms of like, Trump's threats, which we know he will happily carry through on to like put a stranglehold on, certain funding sources that which the city and the state are both pretty reliant on. How do we build an effective opposition? And so I think it behooves all of us to really take the lessons of mass campaign and think about like mass organizing under a Mayor Mamdani. And just as a shameless plug, I did recently write an article about that topic that will be out, I guess, in a few weeks for Hammer and Hope, if people want to check that out. But that's part of what I try to grapple with there is like, what would it mean to take the politics of a mass campaign into, an effective inside-outside strategy for governance.
Well, thank you again for coming on Parallax Views, Hadas Thier. And I hope people will check out your book as well that I mentioned earlier, A People's Guide to Capitalism, An Introduction to Marxist Economics. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.